Hi, my name's James. I work for a company called Nrwl. Vowels are expensive, so try and miss them out. It's a company called Nrwl. Nrwl is actually an animal. It's a whale with a beautiful tusk on its head. It looks like a unicorn and a whale had a baby, but it's a real thing. So this is my standard About Me slide. As of 3 a.m. today, I am a Microsoft MVP for TypeScript, so it immediately went on my slides. Thank you very much. So yeah, I wasted no time in updating my slide. I do love open source. TypeScript obviously is a fantastic example of a well-managed open source project. Some of the other ones that I'm actively contributing to are ESLint, Babel, and Prettier, and particularly from a TypeScript point of view. So I maintain the parser for TypeScript source code for ESLint, and that's actually what powers Prettier's parsing of TypeScript to give you nice and pretty TypeScript code, which is something we leverage inside of NX. Our mission at Nrwl is pretty ambitious, but we try and help enterprises use Angular effectively. We really want enterprises to get the most out of Angular. The lessons that we find from our clients, they're usually universally applicable. It's often not the case that you would start at the largest scale and find that you have problems when you are at the smallest scale. The other way around, it tends to be the case, but for example, I have a personal website in which I'm using some of this theoretically enterprise tooling, but it works very, very effectively. It is the last talk on the second day of a 2-day conference, so I am very much aware, because I'm feeling it myself, that people are tired. So this is an enterprise talk, but there's GIFs and memes and stuff. So there could be one any time. Any slide could have a GIF on it or a meme, so keep a watch out and keep awake. And we will all be rewarded with copious amounts of beer and finished treats, I'm sure. If you want to see me on the web, I have a blog. I need to write more. And I've also got about 10 hours of TypeScript courses if you wanted to learn TypeScript a bit more in depth. So as we know, NX, the toolkit that Nrwl makes, stands for .NET extensions. So we start by taking our Windows machine and compile. Nah, I'm only kidding. It's nothing to do with .NET. Nrwl extensions is what NX stands for. Nice and straightforward. It's our enterprise toolkit. It's completely open source. So if you want to check out how it works behind the scenes, you can do, just like with Angular. And contributions are always welcome. Today, what I want to cover is dead simple questions. They're in order of importance and in order of focus today. I want to cover the why as the main focus of this talk. NX provides solutions, but there's no point in providing solutions until you understand the problems. And so I want you to go away with the seeds planted in your mind. Why would I need to solve these problems? And actually probably reflect on how they manifest within your own code bases. And then when it comes time to evaluate solutions for those problems, oh yeah, I've heard of this thing called NX. That's my plan. I don't want you to memorize the APIs of NX or anything like that, how it's installed, how it's run. I just want you to think about the problem sets that I'm describing here that we've seen over and over and over again with our enterprise clients. So on a much smaller scale, I'll talk about the what, the actual things that we have inside of NX that help you write the best Angular code you can write. And right at the end, I'll briefly give you some tips on finding out more about how we actually do that. So in order to talk about the why, I want to talk about collaboration. At the end of the day, we are programmers, we're developers, any label we want to give ourselves. We write code, but code is interpreted by machines. That's great, but it's read by human beings. We have to collaborate with people in our teams in order to produce code which is going to stand the test of time. For collaboration to work effectively, we have to think about things in a practical way to do with code storage and code structure. Because even though these things aren't going to mean that you have fantastic collaboration, they're going to determine whether or not it's easy for you to have good collaboration or whether you're actually fighting against the system that you have in place. So enterprise teams in particular, but I think you'll find that these apply to basically everybody, they really want UX consistency. We see time and time again that you have teams in different locations or even in the same location that have clear boundaries between them and they end up reinventing the wheel. So there are always tiny, tiny differences between what they produce, even if they're solving the exact same problem. Again, deduping is a big thing to do with that because development hours are expensive. If you've got a team of 10 developers working on one thing and another team of 20 developers works on that same thing, you have wasted an enormous amount of time and money. And of course, we want to be agile. We want our apps to be scalable, adaptable. We want to be able to use them for a long time to come. Somehow, the challenge is to have all of these different wonderful qualities, but somehow empower teams to be autonomous, empower them to be independent units that developers feel they have impact in those teams, they feel they can grow professionally and personally, that they're not just a small cog in a giant machine. So what the hell does storage and structure have to do with collaboration? Before I answer that, I just want to point out how the anticipation of something can often be more powerful than the thing itself. The longer you leave this, the worse it gets. I can't look at it anymore. You can look at it. So yeah, the answer to the question. See, it's enterprise, but we're fun. Okay, we're fun. Code storage is important because on each side of the extremes, we have a mono-repo and we have a poly-repo. So what we mean by those things, with a mono-repo, we have a single repo with literally everything inside of it. This is the extreme end. So every piece of code we write goes into a single repository. This is how we're storing our code. It's nothing to do with the organization, the structure within that. It's just in one place. So this means that we don't have to independently release things. We don't have to coordinate anything. It all just lives in the same bucket. On the other side, we have the poly-repo. No, let's not go through that again. We have the poly-repo, which is that we have our code split up into lots and lots and lots of different repos. And then for an actual unit of compilation that we have to release to our clients, to our users, we want to wire those things together that are completely separate when they're stored, and we want to wire them together to deploy them. When we talk about organization or structure within those, we can think about a monolith and code that is more modular. With a monolith, we're going to blend everything together. All of the concerns are going to be mixed in together, and this can be a problem with abstractions leaking because we can just import from something quite deep into the hierarchy because everything's mixed together. With modular, we split out by decoupled reusable units, so we've got nice boundaries around things. We can test things in isolation, and these are kind of the extreme ends of structure or organization. So to visualize monolith and modular, particularly in an Angular context, you might think about an application that is set up like this. With a monolith, we have all of our different concerns together, so we've got services and components, and it doesn't really matter what those things are doing. They might be presentational or dumb components, which are just taking inputs, rendering some markup, sending outputs back out again. Or they might be really heavy lifting container components, which are fetching things from the server via services, all that kind of stuff. Or on the other hand, we have modular approach, where we split things up by concerns. So we have the shared, dumb, common UI components. We have data libraries that might be state management. They might be fetching things from the server, things like that. So these are the two extremes. However, I want you to think about the fact that a monolith and a mono-repo are not always a guaranteed couple. They don't go hand in hand all the time. Monoliths can easily exist within a mono-repo because the temptation is there to have things blurred across the lines and not have reusable units, but it's not a fixed idea that monolith and a mono-repo are the same thing. If we think about how monolith, mono-repo, poly-repo, modular applies to the organizations and the projects that we know in the wild, we could think about this graph of monolith and mono-repo against each other. Google, as is fairly well known, has everything, effectively everything, in one repository. So they have an extreme mono-repo. However, they have an unbelievable amount of resources, so they have incredible engineers, incredible server infrastructure, to have great tooling to make it very modular. So it sits at this extreme of being a modular mono-repo. And inside of Google, they're able to leverage this amazingly effectively. And it's about whether or not we can bring some of those ideas outside of Google. On the other end of the spectrum, we might have open source on GitHub as being incredibly modular, because everybody's doing their packaging in their own distinct way. They're putting them up there. They have clear boundaries around their code. But it's a true poly repo. We're bringing things in from stored locations which are completely separate from one another. So that can be very difficult to manage. And most enterprise apps tend to sit around here on the graph. They tend to be very monolithic, with abstraction details leaking quite a lot, and they tend to be fairly polyrepoic. I'm going with it. Our thesis, however, is that monolithic polyrepos, so monolith, polyrepo, are where most enterprise apps sit, are actually the enemy of collaboration. So that is what I want to say that structure and organization have to do with collaboration. The reason is that because polyrepos, because of their good level of autonomy that they have, they can be really easy to manage in isolation, but it can be really, really hard to wire them together in an effective way and to prevent yourself reinventing the wheel over and over again and not reusing code. So the two things I really want to focus on there are the consistency element and the reusability element. So first, talking about consistency, this extremely handsome gentleman is Henry Cavill, who appears as Superman in all of the DCEU and most recently in Justice League. The human eye is remarkably adept at picking up the slightest imperfections in consistency. So we see it all the time in UIs, that we have a button that's slightly different. But if any of you saw the Justice League film, Henry Cavill was contracted to work as the bad guy on the latest Mission Impossible film. And they had to do a load of reshoots to make Justice League a watchable film. And in order to play the bad guy, he was contractually obligated to have a huge moustache. And it was a real moustache. Superman does not have a huge moustache. So when it came time to do the reshoots, because the legal situation couldn't be reconciled with the other studio, they had to CGI off his moustache. And oh my God, it's the weirdest thing. So consistency is incredibly important. The reshoots weren't universal across the film. From scene to scene, his face changed from handsome devil to a weird baby face thing. Consistency is important. If you navigate around your application and you go from the admin section to the dashboard and the button changes the padding by 10 pixels, that drives your eye insane. So let's imagine that Nrwl has a design language and we've specified a button. Inside of our design language, we have a specification that says we need this amount of padding, this amount of text size, border, etc. However, we have multiple teams working on multiple separate apps, and so we end up in a situation like this. In the admin app, we have the button looking one way, and you can tell they're related. You can tell they're from the same brand. You can tell roughly the same, but it's just irritating to see this inconsistency in there. It breaks the UX expectations. And why did we end up in this place? Well, it's because each app lives in a separate repo. It's really difficult to bring them together. There could be cultural issues around design spec being ambiguous, and fundamentally, the reason these haven't been brought together is because it's bloody hard to do. You have to set up some kind of build system, you have to test it in isolation, you have CI process, something like that, and you have to manage how you distribute it. So if anybody's tried to build an Angular library, if you saw Yuri's talk, there's a lot involved if you don't use specific tooling, which is dedicated to that approach. Setting this up manually yourself for every single library that you want to produce, if I just wanted a dumb component library with some buttons and some drop-downs and some forms and stuff like that, it's a lot of work to go through. So the fundamental conclusion that I want you to come away with is with polyrepos, when the code is stored in different places and then brought back together again, it's easier to do the wrong thing. Even though we're very good at thinking in black and white, there's rarely cases where something is true and something is false when it comes to these kind of decision making. However, what you can say all the time is whether something makes it easier or more difficult to do. And I would assert very strongly that with a polyrepo, it's easier to mess it up. It's just fundamentally easier to do the wrong thing. You can do the right thing with polyrepos. It's harder to do the right thing. If the team had a mono-repo, we might have a consistent button because we might have something that looks like this. Our homepage app and our admin app that previously had two different buttons on it are now located in exactly the same place. The two teams that contribute to these separate apps are contributing to the same code base. You can you have tooling inside of GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab, whatever, that can say if somebody changes homepage, make somebody from that team review it. That's a tooling issue. But locating them in the same place, it now becomes obviously wrong to not share code between them, because it's trivially in front of you to see, the use case is exactly the same here. The code is right in front of me. It's making it easier to do the right thing. Obviously, you now have the point that if you have this consistent button across the two apps, who makes the decision around if we want to update the padding, for example? But we would assert that this is a good tension to have. This is a good friction between the teams that ends up with the right result at the end. So that's consistency. The other thing I want to talk about is reusability. There's no GIFs for reuse. I mean, there's nothing. There's nothing. I don't even know what that is. So reusability is obviously very important as well, and you might have an example like this. These are two implementations of essentially the exact same thing, and they've done, in this particular case, they've been done with insignificant differences. It's purely just the way in which the code is written that's different, but you could end up with a worse situation where you had functional differences. And why have we ended up with duplication? Well, it's a lot of work, again, to avoid this duplication. You have to set up the CI, you have to set up the testing, you have to manage the distribution of the library, you have to allow for an awkward development lifecycle where, for example, if you build your tests for your service, which you've now nicely isolated and deployed separately, your unit tests for that library might well pass. But then when you come to integrate it, you've already cut a release of that library. It's now version 1.0.1. You import it into your app, and it's broken all of the tests inside of the app because there was no real integration there. So just to hammer it home one more time, with polyrepos, it's easier to do the wrong thing. With a mono-repo, we obviously wouldn't have the duplication in the first place. It's implemented once for all consumers. The approach that they went with, it's not really that important, but it's consistent and it's implemented once. We don't need to separately release it, deploy it, build it. It's built as part of the rest of our repo. And importantly, that means that when we run the tests for our repo, we're testing the integration of this smaller part of the whole. If we make a change to the client's ticket service, we not only test our isolation tests for the service, we also test that our apps haven't broken. So this is where NX comes in. This is where we try to bring the best of the mono-repo and the modularity that we've said is really good. If we have those clear boundaries around pieces of code, we can test them better and we can reason about them much more easily. We don't want to leak details. With a mono-repo, it's easy to leak information between unrelated concerns, so we don't want to do that. However, the important line is actually the one in blue. NX, even though it sounds like we're trying to deal with very difficult problems here, is a very, very thin layer on top of the Angular CLI. If you saw Manfred's talk yesterday, he spoke about schematics, and that's what we leverage in order to provide you more power on top of your existing Angular CLI application. In theory, you could use NX and never actually touch any of our custom stuff. All of your existing Angular CLI commands still work. It's just that we provide you with some extra stuff on top. I've been asked several times, is NX ready for production, or is it, what happens when later down the road people change their ideas? Well, those things are not really a concern, because is it ready for production? Absolutely yes, but also we're mainly dealing with how you set up your repo and how you compile it, but also the fact that we're just a very, very thin layer on top of the Angular CLI means that we are aligning ourselves exactly with the official solution for how to manage your Angular repo. The essential difference that you would see with an NX workspace and a standard Angular CLI project is the fact that we have multiple apps and multiple libs. So we essentially, where you'd have just your source at the top level of your project, we have apps and libs there. Your applications, you don't have to have multiple applications. It's just that unlike the CLI, we allow you to have multiple applications. NX has a built-in understanding of multiple applications living in this mono-repo. And the idea behind libs is so that we can get the best of both worlds. We can have the encapsulated unit that we bring together inside of an application, but we don't need to store it separately. It's not a polyrepo, it's a mono-repo, but we get the benefits of the modular approach. So let's have a look then at this particular example. We've got some Nrwl IO stuff, we've got common UI, and some data access. Those are the types of libs. Our apps are our independently deployable build targets. They're the things that we're actually going to be serving up for users. So for example, we might have that admin section and that dashboard section that we mentioned, whereas the libraries are the encapsulated pieces. If you are already using NX potentially, the best approach you can go with is imagining that your apps is purely the place where you wire together code. Nothing should live in apps, basically. It's just the place where you wire stuff together, and it's the thing that gets built and deployed. Libs contains essentially all of your code. What's a common pattern to have is that we have a lib which matches the name of our app. So here, Nrwl.io. And then that would contain the majority of the things you would expect to find in a normal Angular application. It's specific code to one application. It's not stuff we would reuse, because not all code is reusable. That's not a goal that we have. However, for stuff that is reusable, we would split it out into a separate library. We might have a common UI library. This would contain our button. This would contain our dropdown. And now it becomes trivial to reuse it. The important point, though, is there with explicit APIs. How can we make it so that if we split our code out like this, we're not at risk of adding a new app and then accidentally importing something deep from within another library just because it's convenient to do so because the code is right there. If we're importing from Nrwl.io /source / blah, 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 / if we're doing those deep imports, that's not a good sign that we've drawn clear boundaries around our code. So let's have a look at some of the stuff in action. If we have an Angular CLI project, we're very much used to this idea that we have ngGenerate. Well, this is exactly the same thing in an NX workspace. It's still the Angular CLI, it's just we're providing some stuff on top. So we still have commands like ngGenerate component, we have service, or we don't change any of the standard stuff. But what we do is right here in the same command, we offer you the ability to generate a lib, for example. So you give it a name, and all of the flags that you know and love, like dry run, all still work. Here you can see what it might be like to set up a library inside of an NX workspace. We're updating the Angular CLI JSON to let it know that this lib exists, and we're also going to be creating some boilerplate structure for what you'd want to do. We've got a test, obviously. Testing is really important, write your tests. And this index.ts file is, importantly, where we specify our public API to make sure that we don't leak abstraction details from outside of a lib. When we have the code located like this in a mono-repo, the consistency and reusability that we saw are so important, are first-class features. So as we said, we don't want to leak implementation details. So here's an example, the common UI library use case. We have buttons, we have forms, we have anything we want to share that just displays in a certain way that's consistent with our brand. Inside of our index.ts, we create our public API for this library, and so it's highly likely that we'd want to expose an ng module as one of the core things we want to import into something else from our common UI library. This public API gets specified in this file, and it makes sure that the library can't export something outside of itself that we don't want leaking. The library can deal whatever it wants internally, that's not a problem, but we don't want those abstraction details to leak. Obviously, structure doesn't give us everything we need. We need to leverage tooling here. So this is another thing that NX provides. NX provides some custom TS-lint rules to make sure that you don't do anything like this. You don't want to be doing a deep import to get an ng module out of a library like this. It should be specified on the public API of your library. And there's a really interesting quality you might notice about what we end up here with the ticket module. It looks exactly the same as something we might import from an npm module that we'd installed from a different repo onto our machine. Rather than having to go through the process of deploying something, building it, putting it on a separate repository, and then bringing it into our project, we end up with the same kind of situation, but all within the context of our repo. And this, again, comes down to the point of it's now just easy to split things up into libraries. So you do it more. You split things up whenever you think it's valid, and you suddenly have this nice, reusable, testable block inside of your code base. Is NX full mono-repo? Don't go full mono-repo, guys. No, not quite. It's not a requisite that you commit wholeheartedly to NX. If your company has 28 different apps, we do not expect that you will pile all 28 apps into the thing. There's just concerns that go beyond coding. There's regulatory issues, potentially, depending on the business type. There's cultural issues within the business. Sometimes teams cannot co-locate code together for a good reason, and it's not necessary to get the most out of NX. As I mentioned, I have a website, and I use the NX workspace functionality with a single application. I still get all those same benefits of it being trivial to split code up and reuse it and all that kind of stuff. So as well as the generation and the structural kind of enforcement that we have, NX also provides a couple of other things. It's idiomatic code. Like I said, we provide custom linting. We have some formatting as well, powered by Prettier. We have extra code generation for not just apps and libraries, but also for things like NGRX state management. Victor is on the NGRX team, and he's our co-founder, CTO. So he has fantastic experience and insight onto structuring state management in a particular way that is effective. So we have some schematics which generate NGRX boilerplate for you. Since we did this, the NGRX team themselves came up with their own custom schematics, so we're going to make sure that we're aligned on that so it's not confusing for users and find the best mix of the two. Also, we generate some tests. Tests are one of those things where you just have to get into the habit of writing them, so whenever you generate anything inside of NX, we make sure we have a corresponding test file to go with it. Like I said, we've got linting and formatting, and we have utilities to run in your CI environment. It's all very good having a good local environment, but we need to make sure we're backing that up on a remote source of truth somewhere. So we make sure that your code has been formatted correctly across all of your users before it can be merged into master, that kind of thing. And we also have a very, very, very tiny amount of runtime helpers. So Victor particularly noticed that data persistence and some certain aspects of state management are very, very difficult to get right. And so we have some runtime helpers for making sure that you don't end up with race conditions and things like that. Mostly NX is concerning itself with helping you build and run your application, but in this particular case, we do have a few runtime helpers. And there's just going to be more and more. We work very closely with the CLI teams themselves to have points of extensibility. We will always stick as close to the CLI as we possibly can, but we're not going to stop. We're going to keep adding new tools, keep adding new helpers, and just like with Angular, when you upgrade to a new version, you will get the benefits of the updated version of NX. In our particular case, we have a tool called NX Migrate, just like the newly released Angular CLI update tool. And in that case, we update all of your versioning. We go through your code base and find the old APIs, change them to the new APIs. It's very, very cool. And as I mentioned right at the end, I would mention the how. So the key points of the how, if you want to find out more, schematics. I would just advise watching Manfred's talk when it's on YouTube if you didn't see it already. If you want to learn more about TSLint and how you can extend it with your own custom rules, that's how we leverage those things like the deep import path checking. Prettier is what powers our code formatting. It's exploded in popularity recently. It's something I work on. And the most important thing for how NX is made is that Victor Savkin has high enough concentration of caffeine in his bloodstream. Victor's fantastic, and I love working with him. And I look forward to helping him out as much as possible with the CLI, with the NX, but he's been the powerhouse behind it so far. Thanks very much. That was the end of my talk.